Midnight at the Wally Range Hotel is filled with music, laughter, and whispers of business. At a corner table sits Jimmy Donnelly, known across Manchester as Jimmy the Weed. Around him, deals are made with handshakes, debts are settled with glances. Some men look at him with admiration, others with quiet fear. He's no giant, no shouting boss, but his presence controls the room. Calm, confident, untouchable. To the police, he's a name that never fades from the files. To the streets, he's a legend. The man who ran Manchester without fear, noise, or blood. How did he do it? Let's find out. Jimmy Donnelly was brought up in the centre of Manchester. The city was hard, noisy, and covered with unwritten rules. Life taught you early that strength wasn't about size. It was about attitude, pride, and knowing when to stand your ground. Jimmy learned those lessons young. He watched men work hard, fight hard, and survive with dignity. Every street corner had a story. Every pub had a lesson. Manchester shaped him before he ever shaped the city. Money was short in most homes. Families relied on quick thinking and loyalty. People didn't have much, but they had pride. Jimmy's world was built on respect. You kept your word, and people kept theirs. He wasn't raised in comfort, but in community. The neighbors looked out for one another. That sense of belonging would stay with him for life. It gave him roots that no amount of danger could shake. From an early age, Jimmy stood out. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't need to be. His calm nature and sharp eyes earned quiet respect. Even the older men noticed his confidence. He carried himself like someone who already knew how the world worked. There was no rush in his words, no panic in his actions. People remembered that. In a place where tempers were quick, Jimmy's control made him different. At 16, he was working at Smithfield Market. The market was busy, noisy, and filled with tough talk. One day a workmate joked, "He grows on you, this fella, like a weed." The name stuck instantly. Since then, he was Jimmy the Weed. This was just a mere nickname, but it suited well. He was not the strongest or the richest, but like a weed, he survived anywhere. The Manchester of his youth was alive with both opportunity and risk. The police had power, but the people had their own rules. Trust wasn't given freely, you earned it by action, not words. Jimmy understood that balance better than most. He didn't chase violence, but he never ran from it. When fights broke out, he didn't swing first. He waited, watched, and only struck when he had to. That mix of patience and courage built his early reputation. By the early 1960s, Manchester was changing fast. Music filled the clubs, and money flowed through the city. Behind the scenes, local gangs began to rise. But Jimmy was not like the rest. He didn't shout about power. He didn't brag about money. He worked quietly, building friendships that crossed every line from market traders to nightclub owners. People trusted him because he kept things fair. He preferred peace, but he knew how to end trouble if it came his way. Those early years built the foundation of who he became. The city taught him survival, loyalty, and control. He learned how to handle fear without showing it. He learned that silence often carried more power than words. The streets of Manchester didn't raise Jimmy Donnelly. They forged Jimmy the Weed, the man who would one day rule them with calm authority. The 1960s brought change to Manchester. The factories were closing, but the streets were alive. Pubs filled with noise, clubs opened on every corner, and new faces appeared every night. Money started to move in different ways. Some earned it honestly, others found their own paths. In this restless city, one man began to stand out, Jimmy Donnelly. People called him calm, steady, and sharp. He wasn't loud, but his silence carried weight. When Jimmy spoke, people listened. The name that followed him everywhere was born years earlier. It started as a joke in the Smithfield Market. Jimmy was 16, working hard like everyone else. One of his mates laughed and said, "He grows on you, this fella, like a weed." It was said once, but it stuck forever. Jimmy the Weed. Simple words, yet they captured everything about him. He was tough to break, hard to stop, and always came back stronger. The name was humorous, yet it carried the truth. Whatever happened in life, Jimmy could overcome it. Jimmy himself did not pursue that nickname. It came to him naturally. He became an unforgettable person in a rather noisy city. It turned into a sign of honor, a sign of strength. People started using it with a mix of humor and admiration. The police knew it too. They wrote it in their files, often without proof of any crime. To them, Jimmy the Weed meant someone who was always there, always one step ahead. To the streets, it meant something else. A man who could handle himself without losing his head. Names carried power in those days. In Manchester's underworld, a name could protect you or destroy you. Jimmy understood this better than anyone. His name sounded harmless, but people who knew him never underestimated him. The Weed reminded everyone that he could grow in any condition. You could try to cut him down, but he'd return stronger. It wasn't a warning, it was a statement of who he was, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. His reputation spread through action, not words. Jimmy earned respect the hard way. He never intimidated, he never boasted, and he never posed as someone he was not. He assisted when he was able to, and solved issues when he had to. He was more concerned with fairness than fear. Those who crossed him learned their lesson, but those on his side never forgot his loyalty. He never needed to yell to be heard. His calmness in danger made him stand apart in a city full of tough men. By the late 1960s, Jimmy's name was known everywhere in Manchester. From pubs to clubs, people spoke about Jimmy the Weed. He'd become part of the city's rhythm, respected by both workers and street figures. Even the police couldn't ignore his influence. He wasn't the biggest man in the room, but he was often the one in control. His voice stayed soft, but his presence filled any space he entered. Jimmy the Weed had become more than a nickname. It was a symbol of survival, charm, and quiet strength. Behind that name stood a man who built power not through fear, but through respect. And as his legend grew, so did the group that would soon make him one of the most notorious names in Manchester's underworld, the Quality Street Gang. Towards the end of the 1960s, Manchester was changed. The factories were less noisy, but the pubs were noisier. The city had a nighttime business which was making deals, blood and rollicking. Out of this mix came a group that would define Manchester's underworld, the Quality Street Gang. It was a friendly, nearly harmless name, which everyone in the city knew. They were not like the Krays of London or the Richardsons of the South. They didn't parade violence or chase headlines. They ruled by reputation, loyalty, and quiet control. And right in the middle of it all was Jimmy the Weed. The Quality Street Gang was not built on rules or ranks. There were no official meetings or plans. It was a brotherhood, a group of trusted men who looked out for one another. Each member brought something different to the table. Some ran pubs, others worked the doors, and a few handled business that was best left unspoken. Together they formed an invisible web across Manchester. If you caused trouble in a pub, it didn't stay secret for long. Within minutes, someone from the gang would appear to handle it. Most times that alone was enough to end any problem. Jimmy Donnelly fit naturally into this circle. He wasn't loud, but people listened when he spoke. His calm voice carried authority that no shouting could match. He didn't need to threaten anyone. His reputation did that for him. People respected him because he was fair. He treated everyone the same, from barmen to businessmen. When he walked into the room, he didn't have to act tough. His presence spoke for itself. In a world full of quick tempers, Jimmy's calmness made him stand apart. The gang's main meeting place was the Wally Range Hotel. It was more than a pub. It was their base, their safe ground, and their social club. Every night it was filled with laughter, music, and smoke. Behind the cheerful noise, business was being done quietly. Favors were traded, debts were paid, and disputes were settled before they grew. The hotel's landlady, Phyllis Linnett, became part of their world too. Her son, Phil Linnett, played his guitar there as a young man. Years later, Phil became the frontman of Thin Lizzy and immortalized Jimmy in a song, Johnny the Fox Meets Jimmy the Weed. That moment linked the gang forever to Manchester's music history. The Quality Street Gang wasn't known for unnecessary violence. They didn't fight to prove themselves. Their strength came from unity. If you respected them, you were safe. If you didn't, you faced consequences. They didn't brag about power. but everyone in Manchester knew who ran the city's nightlife. The gang's influence reached into pubs, clubs, and even the boxing scene. They were seen as protectors by some and enforcers by others. Either way, their control was complete. Police officers knew who they were, but couldn't pin them down. The gang was careful, they spoke little, moved smartly, and left no evidence behind. Some members were questioned or even charged, but convictions were rare. They stayed ahead because they understood balance. Jimmy especially knew how to avoid unnecessary attention. He built his life around trust, silence, and respect. That quiet discipline kept him safe for decades. To many people in Manchester, the Quality Street Gang wasn't just feared, they were also respected. They kept order in a city that could easily fall into chaos. Even local business owners admitted that life felt safer when the gang was around. Trouble rarely lasted long when Jimmy and his men were nearby. Those nights at the Wally Range Hotel became part of local legend. Behind the jokes and songs, real power flowed through that room. Jimmy the Weed sat at the center of it all, calm, watchful, and untouchable. He was the link that held the group together, the man who kept chaos away with a quiet word. But power like that never stays hidden forever. The more peaceful Jimmy appeared, the more curious the world became. Soon, the police, the press, and even politicians would want to know who Jimmy the Weed really was and how far his influence reached. By the early 70s, Jimmy the Weed was a well-known name in Manchester. He had fame in pubs, clubs, and police stations. He was both prudently and admiringly spoken. Jimmy wasn't a loud man. In order to be heard, he did not have to shout. The quietness of his confidence was louder than threat. He traveled silently, yet his presence was all around the city. Manchester was a city full of noise, work, and change. By day it looked normal, full of markets and factory smoke. But when night came, a different world came alive. The pubs filled with laughter, the clubs with deals, and the backrooms with quiet conversations. The Quality Street Gang stood in the middle of this world. They didn't rule through violence, they ruled through presence. Everyone knew that if trouble started, they would handle it fast. That sense of order gave the city a strange kind of peace. Jimmy became the face of that peace. He had friends in every corner, business owners, boxers, and musicians. He understood people better than most. If there was a problem, he could fix it. Sometimes all he needed was a calm talk. Other times a warning was enough. He didn't use fear without reason. His power came from fairness. People trusted him because he treated them with respect, even when business got rough. He wasn't a man to brag. He didn't wear fancy suits or drive expensive cars. His strength was quiet. He believed loyalty mattered more than money. If someone owed him, he gave them time to pay. But if someone betrayed him, the answer was firm. He never struck without reason. Even when violence came, it came with purpose. He once said he had been violent all his life, but only when he had to be. It wasn't pride, it was survival. That honesty made him stand apart from other hard men in the city. Many fought for attention. Jimmy didn't have to. He already had it. His name carried weight because it came with consistency. People knew what to expect from him: fairness, loyalty, and control. That steadiness kept the Quality Street Gang united. It also kept Manchester's nightlife under control. Bar owners, club managers, and even the police understood one thing. When Jimmy stepped in, problems stopped. The police knew who he was, but they couldn't touch him. Their files were full of names and stories, but not proof. Cases were opened, but evidence disappeared. Witnesses said nothing. People respected Jimmy too much to cross him. The silence around him became part of his legend. Even officers who disliked him admitted one thing: he ran a cleaner city than they did. Jimmy never called himself a boss. He didn't need to. His authority came naturally. The gang worked like a family, and he was its calm center. He never asked for fame, but it followed him everywhere. To some, he was a criminal. To others, he was the man who kept Manchester safe. In truth, he was both a balance of danger and decency that defined his time. But power never stays quiet for long. As Jimmy's influence grew, so did curiosity. People began to ask who he really was and how far his reach extended. The myth of Jimmy the Weed was strong, but soon it would face its greatest test. By the mid-1970s, Jimmy the Weed was no longer just a name from the streets. He had become part of Manchester's culture. His world mixed business, friendship, and music. The line between legend and reality began to blur. People spoke of him like a character from a film. Some stories were true, others were stretched, but all carried the same tone of respect. Jimmy didn't seek fame, yet fame found him in the most unexpected way. The Wally Range Hotel was still his base. It was more than a pub. It was a meeting point for everyone who mattered. Gang members, musicians, and locals all gathered under the same roof. The hotel's landlady, Phyllis Linnett, had known Jimmy for years. She treated him like family. Her son, a young musician named Phil Linnett, often played his guitar in the corner. He grew up watching Jimmy and his friends, listening to their stories and feeling their presence. That world left a mark on him. Years later, Phil formed the rock band Thin Lizzy. They became one of the biggest acts of the decade. Fame took Phil far from Manchester, but the memories of the Wally Range Hotel never faded. One day he wrote a song that captured the spirit of those nights. Johnny the Fox meets Jimmy the Weed. It was more than a tune. It was a symbol of how deeply Jimmy had influenced those around him. For the first time, the man from Manchester's Underworld became part of rock history. The song didn't tell Jimmy's life directly. Instead, it mirrored the mix of charm and danger he carried. It showed how his reputation reached beyond the criminal world and into popular culture. Fans of Thin Lizzy sang along, unaware that Jimmy the Weed was a real person walking the streets of Manchester. The legend grew quietly, fed by music, stories, and whispers in pubs. Jimmy's name had become larger than his life. But the myths around him were not just built on fame, they came from people who saw him. To some, he was a gangster who ruled with silence. To others, he was a man who looked after his own and kept the streets safe. He didn't correct the stories. He let people believe what they wanted. That mystery made him even more fascinating. The more people spoke, the less anyone really knew. The connection between Jimmy and Thin Lizzy also changed how outsiders saw Manchester. The city was no longer just about factories and football. It was now known for its mix of music, crime, and personality. Jimmy's friendship with Phil Linnett symbolized that blend. Two different men from two different worlds, united by respect. One played the guitar, the other played the game of survival. Both understood loyalty and pride. As the years passed, Jimmy's name kept spreading. The song gave him a kind of immortality. Even those who never met him felt like they knew him. He had become part of Manchester's story, half man, half myth. And behind every rumor, one truth remained. Jimmy the Weed had found a way to live forever through music and memory. But fame has its own price, and soon the attention that came with being a legend would start drawing eyes that could not be ignored, especially those of the police and the press. By the late 1970s, Jimmy the Weed's life had moved far beyond the pubs of Manchester. His name was known across the city and whispered far beyond it. He had power, respect, and influence. But that kind of control always brings attention. The police had watched him for years. They saw his calm life, his friends in business, and his quiet authority. But they also saw what they believed was a network of crime hidden behind it all. They couldn't prove it, but they never stopped trying. The police files were thick with notes about the Quality Street gang. They believed the group was behind robberies, protection rackets, and fraud across the country. Yet arrests rarely led to convictions. The gang was too careful. They worked in silence, avoided open violence, and never left witnesses. That frustrated the police deeply. In public, they called the gang untouchable. In private, they knew that men like Jimmy had influence that reached further than the law could go. Then came the rumors that changed everything. Some officers began to suspect that Jimmy and his brother Arthur had ties to the Irish Republican Army. The idea spread quickly after the 1996 Manchester bombing, though no proof ever surfaced. Many in the gang had Irish connections through family or friends. To investigators, that looked suspicious. But Jimmy always denied involvement. He said people mixed up friendships with politics. He was clear that his world was crime, not war. Still, the link between the gang and the police grew tangled in an unexpected way. In 1986, Deputy Chief Constable John Stalker was leading a sensitive investigation into alleged shoot-to-kill operations in Northern Ireland. He was known as an honest man, respected even by those he investigated. But soon, stories spread that Stalker was close to members of the Quality Street gang, including Jimmy's associate Kevin Taylor. The rumor cost Stalker his job. He was suspended, accused of having links to Manchester's Underworld. The truth, however, was different. Jimmy later said that Stalker had never given them anything and had never taken a favor. He believed the police used the story to ruin a good man's name. Kevin Taylor, who had once borrowed money from the gang but always repaid it, was destroyed by the scandal. His business collapsed, and though he later won compensation, he never recovered. For Jimmy, it was proof that power and politics could crush anyone, even those who stayed honest. Through it all, Jimmy stayed calm. He didn't fight back in public or boast about beating the system. He simply carried on with his life. The police could watch, but they couldn't touch him. His silence protected him more than any lawyer could. He knew that speaking too much only brought more attention. By the 1980s, Jimmy's world had changed. He was older, wealthier, and more cautious. The wild years were over, replaced by quiet nights and careful movements. Yet the pressure never stopped. The police still followed his name, and reporters still searched for stories. To the public, he was a legend. To the police, he was unfinished business. And to Jimmy, it was all just noise, because in Manchester, silence had always been his greatest weapon. But time doesn't stop for anyone. The city that once feared and respected him was changing fast. New players were arriving, and the old rules were fading away. By the 1980s, Manchester was changing faster than ever. The old faces of the city's underworld were fading. The streets that once belonged to men like Jimmy the Weed were no longer calm. A new kind of criminal had arrived. They were younger, louder, and far more dangerous. The rules that once kept order were disappearing, and so was the quiet respect that defined Jimmy's time. In the 60s and 70s, the Quality Street gang had kept the peace in their own way. They didn't allow chaos. Trouble was dealt with quickly, but fairly. Their power came from unity and trust, not from drugs or greed. Jimmy and his friends believed in boundaries. They made money, but they also believed in keeping the city safe. They never touched drugs, and they never hurt ordinary people. To them, there was still a code and an understanding between criminals and the community. But the next generation didn't follow that code. The new gangs from across areas like Salford and Moss Side didn't care about rules. They wanted quick money and street fame. They fought over drugs, clubs, and control. Guns began to replace fists. Fear replaced respect. The balance that Jimmy had helped build was broken. The streets became unpredictable, and violence became the new language. Jimmy saw it all from a distance. By then, he and many of his old friends had retired. They had made their money and wanted peace. Most of them moved out of the city to live quietly. They met a few times a week for meals and memories, but the world they built was gone. The pubs they once ruled were now filled with new faces and new dangers. It was no longer the Manchester they knew. The police noticed the change too. Crime rates climbed every year. In 1984, there were 89 armed robberies in Manchester. By 1985, that number had jumped to 139. The order that once existed under the Quality Street gang had vanished. The new gangs didn't care about keeping control. They wanted chaos, and they got it. Jimmy's world had been built on loyalty and silence. Theirs was built on drugs and fear. He didn't admire what came after him. To him, the new criminals had lost what made the old ways work: respect. Even those who broke the law once understood limits. Now there were none. Violence was random. The streets he once protected had become something darker. By the late 80s, Jimmy was an old man watching a young city destroy itself. He no longer tried to control it. The life he knew had passed. Manchester had moved on to a colder kind of crime. The faces were new, but the cost was the same. The era of order was over, and so was the name that once kept it together: Jimmy the Weed. But even as the streets changed, one thing still remained: the legend of the man who ruled them with calm, not with fear. Jimmy the Weed's name still lingers in Manchester's memory. He lived by his own code, loyal, charm, and fair, even in a world built on crime. People feared him, yet many respected him more. In his later years, he lived quietly, meeting old friends and sharing stories of the past. He never pretended to be innocent and never showed regret. To him, Life was about survival and respect. Manchester has changed, but its legend remains. Jimmy the Weed is remembered not for violence, but for control, loyalty, and silence. The man who ruled the streets without shouting. Remember to subscribe to the channel for more interesting videos just like this, and we'll see you in the next one.